In our previous session, we saw how God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. Then God led them to Mount Sinai. This map shows its most probable location. There at the foot of this mountain, perhaps in the valley you can see here, God made a covenant with his people. A covenant is a binding agreement. It brings two parties into relationship with each other. A modern-day example of a covenant is marriage. A man and a woman make binding commitments to each other and enter into a new relationship together. God's covenant with Israel was, in fact, rather like a marriage. God became the husband of his people. Remember what we learnt in our first session. The Bible story is, at its heart, a love story. The goal of human history is a marriage between Jesus Christ and God's people. That marriage relationship began back there at Mount Sinai. At their wedding ceremony, the bride and groom make vows to each other. Likewise, God and his people made vows to each other. God made a vow to Israel. He said, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Israel in turn made a vow to God. They promised to obey him. During the covenant ceremony, Moses read the book of the covenant to the people. This book was, it seems, what is now Exodus chapters 20 to 23. It begins with the 10 Commandments. The people vowed, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." In the Garden of Eden, humanity disobeyed God. Now God's new humanity, Israel, promised to obey him. So God and his people made vows to each other. Secondly, there was a special covenant ceremony. In many present-day weddings, the bride and groom exchange rings and sign the marriage register. But this wedding ceremony between God and Israel involved blood. Animals were sacrificed. Moses splashed some of their blood against an altar, which may have been built of stones. This altar seems to have represented God. Then Moses splashed blood over the book of the covenant and over the people. Why did Moses do this? There may well be more than one reason. Two reasons may be these. Firstly, splashing blood on both the people and the altar seems to symbolize that Israel and God were now linked together in covenant commitment to each other. Secondly, perhaps God and his people Israel were saying, in effect, "May I be like these dead animals if I should ever break this covenant." God's people did break the covenant. They disobeyed God. They should have suffered the penalty of death. But God accepted the death of animals instead, as we'll see later in this session. After a wedding ceremony, there's a wedding reception. People enjoy a meal together. After this covenant ceremony at Sinai, too, there was a meal. Moses climbed Mount Sinai, accompanied by his brother Aaron and 2 of his sons and 70 elders of Israel. On the mountain, these men saw God. Under his feet was a pavement, blue like sapphire, clear as the sky. Then Moses and the others ate and drank in God's presence. In those days, people would eat only with other people they were in relationship with, family members, friends, or allies. Now, on Mount Sinai, representatives of Israel enjoyed a meal in God's presence. This showed that Israel was now in relationship with God. God was Israel's husband. Israel was his precious bride. Finally, after their wedding, a married couple set up home together. So now God made plans to live with his people. At that time, God's people were living in tents. So God commanded Moses to make him a tent. He was going to live with his people in a tent, just as they did. Here's a plan of God's tent. It's called the tabernacle. Around the tabernacle was a courtyard. In the courtyard was an altar and a basin. The tabernacle itself was divided into 2 rooms. The larger room was the holy place. The smaller room was the most holy place. Let's now take a tour of this wonderful tent. Imagine you're an Israelite camping in the desert near Mount Sinai. The tabernacle is in the center of the camp. As you approach it, you can see a screen around it. What you're seeing in this and the following photographs is a full-scale replica of the tabernacle. It's pitched in the desert in southern Israel. On the eastern side of the screen there's a curtain. Going through this curtain, you find yourself in the courtyard. In front of you is an altar. You'll probably see animal sacrifices burning on it. Walking past the altar, you pass a basin. You may see priests washing there. Then you arrive at the tabernacle itself. It's quite a large tent, about 15 feet high and wide, and about 45 feet long. There's a beautiful embroidered curtain at the entrance. Only the priests can enter this tent, so let's imagine you're a priest. On entering, you find yourself in a room called the Holy Place. You can see models of 2 priests here. The sides of the tent are supported by wooden frames overlaid with gold set in silver sockets. Over these frames is draped a beautiful multicolored covering decorated with special heavenly beings called cherubs. Above this innermost covering are other protective coverings. To your left there's a golden candlestick with 7 branches. It fills the holy place with light. On your right is a table overlaid with gold. The main items on this table are 12 loaves of bread. The priests ate this bread week by week. Like the meal on Mount Sinai, it seems that eating this bread in God's presence celebrated the relationship between God and his people, represented by the priests. At the back of the holy place is an altar overlaid with gold. Incense is burning on it. A wonderful fragrance fills the room. Behind this altar there's a beautiful curtain. Beyond this curtain is the innermost room, called the Most Holy Place. This room contains the Ark of the Covenant. This is a box overlaid with gold. On the box is a cover of pure gold. On either end of this cover is a golden cherub. The Most Holy Place was God's home on earth. God is present everywhere, but he was present in this room in a special way. In fact, it was his throne room. From this room God reigned over his people. And because God was present there in a special way, the Most Holy Place was so holy that only the high priest could enter it, and only on one day each year, the Day of Atonement. God's first home on earth was the Garden of Eden. The tabernacle was his new home on earth. It was, in a way, a new Garden of Eden. For example, in the garden was the tree of life. There was a symbolic tree in the tabernacle, the candlestick in the holy place. This candlestick had branches and cups shaped like the flowers of an almond tree. In the Garden of Eden, God lived with mankind, Adam and Eve. Israel was his new mankind, so God shared his new home with them too. He appointed special people to come into his home. These people were the priests. They represented the whole nation. God chose certain men from the tribe of Levi to be his priests, Aaron and his male descendants. You can see models of two priests here. The one dressed in white robes represents an ordinary priest. The one in colourful robes represents the high priest. The priests worshipped and served God on behalf of the whole nation. They looked after the tabernacle and everything that went on in it. They kept it clean and holy. Another duty they had was to teach people about God's law. Other men from the tribe of Levi, called Levites, helped the priests in various ways. In this picture, Levites are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. This was one of their duties as God's people journeyed through the desert. But God also wanted the whole nation to be his priests. God wanted them to be a kingdom of priests who all worshipped and served him. When the tabernacle was finished, God moved in. A cloud covered the tabernacle, and God's glory filled it. God now lived among his people. But God's people weren't perfect. Like the rest of mankind, they were sinners. How could they possibly live in the presence of the holy God? God showed them how through his law. The law comprises the books of Leviticus, together with portions of the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Hebrew word for law is Torah, meaning instruction or guidance. This is a Hebrew scroll containing the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These books include the law. In the law, God showed his people how to live. He instructed them about the sacrifices and about the priests and Levites. He showed them how to keep the tabernacle, themselves, and their camp, and later the promised land, clean and holy, in a state fit for the holy God to live among them. He set out their calendar of special days and festivals, and the gifts that they were to give him. These gifts included their firstborn sons and firstborn animals, the first fruits of their crops, and 1/10 of their agricultural produce, and of their cattle, sheep, and goats. And through the law, God revealed his character, his righteousness and holiness, his goodness and love, his grace and mercy. God commanded his people to offer sacrifices to him. The law describes these in great detail. To us, they seem complicated and puzzling. Many were animal sacrifices. To us, these may even seem gruesome, with all the butchery and blood that many of them involved. But these sacrifices, if they were offered with repentant hearts, were God's Old Testament way of dealing with sin and restoring his people to relationship with himself. As we've just said, many sacrifices involved killing an animal. They cost a life. The animal died instead of the people who offered the sacrifice. This shows how very serious sin really is. There were 5 basic types of sacrifice. They were offered in the courtyard of the tabernacle. The altar there was the focus of the sacrificial system. The purification offering, also called the sin offering, was either an animal sacrifice or an offering of flour. Imagine spilling wine on your carpet. The wine pollutes the carpet. It leaves a stain. That's what sin is like. Sin pollutes. It pollutes people. and it polluted God's home, the tabernacle, too. But God accepted the purification offering as his chosen way to cleanse away the pollution of sin. Sin sometimes requires something to be put right, too. In other words, it may require restitution. The restitution offering, also called the guilt offering or trespass offering, provided a way for certain things to be put right. It involved an animal sacrifice. This was often accompanied by payment of money as compensation for the sin. And if anything had been stolen, that had to be given back too. Through the burnt offering and the grain offering, people could dedicate themselves and their daily work and the produce of their land to God. The final kind of sacrifice was the fellowship offering, also called the peace offering. The person who offered this kind of sacrifice also ate some of it. Others would be invited to share the meal too. They ate this meal in God's presence. Like other meals, this meal symbolized relationship. The fellowship offering celebrated the friendship between God and everyone who ate this meal. On any one occasion, only one or some of these sacrifices would typically be needed. But taken together, these 5 sacrifices showed how a sinner could become friends with God. Firstly, they needed cleansing from the pollution of sin. Secondly, they might need to put things right. Then they needed to dedicate themselves, their work, and the produce of their land to God. Finally, they could celebrate their restored friendship with God through the fellowship offering. There were other sacrifices too. In particular, 2 special sacrifices were offered once a year. One of these was the Passover Sacrifice. In the spring, at the festival of Passover, each family would kill a lamb or a goat and eat it as part of the meal. The Samaritan community, who live in Israel and the Palestinian territories, still do this. This photo shows them preparing a Passover lamb for roasting. The festival of Passover celebrated Israel's rescue from slavery in Egypt, and the Passover meal reaffirmed their covenant relationship with God. Immediately after the Passover was the festival of unleavened bread. It lasted 7 days. Before the Passover, people had to destroy anything containing yeast. Then, during the festival of unleavened bread, they ate nothing containing yeast. This picture shows a kind of unleavened bread called matzo. It's a sort of cracker. It's one of the kinds of unleavened bread that is eaten during Passover. Why did God's people avoid eating things containing yeast during this festival? People typically used to make their bread rise, not by letting the dough ferment naturally, but by adding a piece of old dough. But this old dough could also pass on germs. So at Passover, they destroyed any dough and bread that contained yeast. It was a kind of decontamination process. It symbolized putting an end to sin. The second special annual sacrifice was offered on the Day of Atonement. It was a purification offering. It covered all the nation's sins over the previous year. This offering consisted of 2 goats. One of the 2 goats was killed. The high priest sprinkled some of its blood in the most holy place. Before the goat was killed, the high priest also sprinkled blood from a bull in the most holy place to cover his own sins and the sins of the priests. The high priest probably also smeared the blood of the bull and the goat on the altar of incense and sprinkled it in the holy place too. Finally, the high priest smeared and sprinkled the blood on the altar in the courtyard. These blood rituals were symbolic acts. The blood represented the death of the animals. Because of their sin, God's people should have suffered the penalty of death, eternal separation from God. But God graciously accepted the death of the animals instead. So the people's sins were now covered. The people and the tabernacle were now purified from the defilement caused by their sins, and the altar in the courtyard was now reconsecrated for use again. The sprinkling and the smearing of the blood symbolized this purification and reconsecration. Then the high priest placed his hands on the head of the other goat, called the scapegoat, and confessed the sins of the whole nation over it. It seems that the goat was now symbolically considered responsible for all the sins of Israel over the previous year. Then the scapegoat was led out eastward into the desert and released. This painting imagines the awful scene. The poor animal stands alone and forlorn in a desolate wilderness. As we saw in Session 4, death is a set of broken relationships. First and foremost, death is a broken relationship with God. God's people had sinned. The penalty was death, separation from God. But the scapegoat symbolically suffered this penalty in their place. Symbolically, it suffered separation from God. It was led away into the wilderness, far away from God's presence in the tabernacle. But animal sacrifices could never really deal with sins. Only Jesus could do that. By his sacrifice of himself on the cross, Jesus made full and perfect atonement for sins. These Old Testament sacrifices point forward to Jesus' sacrificial death. God also appointed a number of holy times during each year. The seventh day of each week was called the Sabbath day. On that day no work was to be done, people were to rest. There were also 7 annual festivals. In the earlier part of spring there was the Passover, followed by the festival of unleavened bread, which lasted for 7 days. During unleavened bread, the festival of first fruits took place. On this day, people offered the first fruits of their cereal harvest. 50 days after the festival of first fruits, the festival of Pentecost took place. In the autumn, on the first day of the 7th month, was the festival of trumpets. 10 days later was the Day of Atonement, and 5 days after that, the festival of tabernacles began. It lasted 8 days. Each Sabbath day, people were to meet together at holy gatherings. There were to be holy gatherings on various days during the annual festivals too. Why did God appoint these holy times? Some of the festivals looked back to the past. At Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, God's people celebrated their history. For example, during Tabernacles, people were to live outdoors in temporary shelters. This was in memory of the 40 years that they lived in the desert before entering the Promised Land. We'll tell the story of these 40 years in our next session. Secondly, 3 of the festivals celebrated the present. At First Fruits, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, people celebrated the harvests that God provided for them year by year. Finally, all the festivals looked to the future. They looked forward to what Jesus Christ would do. For example, Jesus fulfilled the festival of Passover. He is our Passover lamb. We'll see how in a later session. Finally, in addition to the Sabbath day, there was a Sabbath year and a year of Jubilee. Every 7 years was a Sabbath year. During this year the land lay fallow. People did no agricultural work. Debts were to be cancelled too. Every 50th year was a year of Jubilee. This was a Sabbath year, but in addition, Israelites who had become servants to other Israelites were to be released. Land or houses that had been sold off were to be given back to their original owners at no cost. For people who, because of circumstances, had sold land, property, or even themselves as servants to their fellow Israelites, the slate was to be wiped clean. It was to be a new beginning for them. And through the Sabbath days and years, and especially through the years of Jubilee, God intended his people to have a little foretaste of life in the new heaven and earth, a life free from toil and difficulty, a life of freedom, joy, and blessing. In our next session, we'll trace the history of God's people until the time of King Solomon.